Kalia Yeagle, and I'm a musician and an educator. I play a lot of fiddle and sing with a band called Bill and the Bells, and I teach old-time music at East Tennessee State University. It's a big question, one that I don't like to answer, and I think if you ask a lot of old-time musicians, they'll kind of say the same thing because it's this big umbrella term that's been used for so many different things and for so many different purposes. But I'd like to think that at its heart, what it's referring to in essence is this music of rural North America that has its roots in fiddle and banjo music. It's inextricably linked to dance and to community functions. We all love boundaries and definitions, and I think that it's the term old-time music presents a challenge because it really doesn't fit within some boundaries very cleanly, because that word's been used by record labels for certain purposes, right, to sell records, and it's been used by people to define their own music, which sometimes feels contradictory to other examples that we also think of as being old-time music. So it's tough. It's a tough term to let settle. But in a way, that's also an invitation to celebrate all of the things that it can include. Yeah. It has always been important to highlight those stories because they've always been there. With history, let's see. We are the history makers of today, right? We're defining the way that history will be told in the future, and we kind of have a responsibility as contemporary musicians and community members to think deeply about the stories that we're telling, whose stories they are, who those stories are for, and who gets to do the storytelling. Historically, we haven't done a great job of telling the stories of women in old-time music, even though they've always been there. And of course, we have a responsibility today to bring those stories to light and also to celebrate the stories that we're writing today that also involve marginalized voices in old-time music. I mean, this isn't unique to old-time music, right? We're constantly telling stories about who we are and who we aren't, and what our traditions are and what they aren't, and who they're for and who they're not for. So old-time music is no different, right? We choose to elevate certain voices over others, and that's a powerful thing that we can do as consumers of music, as makers of music, and as just general community members. So we might as well be a little more thoughtful about whose stories we're telling. And it's not just out of like, ooh, duty and responsibility. It's also a joyful act, right? It's a thing that we get to be curious about. I think that's, one of the best things we can do as learners and thinkers and speakers and doers, right, is to remain curious and to try and dig deeper and to try and find like the heart of the matter, or to find, ooh, where did this thing come from, and where did it come from before that, and who made the decisions along the line that shaped this thing that I've come to know and love today. So I was thinking about influences, and there's a lot of women in old-time music that I've found inspirational, and especially at this phase of my life where I've been making music for long enough that I have a sense of what my music is and how it continues to evolve, and my curiosity is shifting more and more towards finding the sounds and voices of people that I can connect to on a deeper level, and often that means finding other marginalized voices in the music. So a lot of women that have inspired me include fiddlers like Violet Hensley, who's still alive, right? She's an Ozark fiddler, amazing person, and I love her versions of tunes. A lot of them are like standards with a twist, which is just perfection in my book. Emily Dickerson is a great fiddler. I'm sure Tatiana talked about her. I know she's a big fan. Other living legends like Alice Gerrard, who's still around. And then peers that are like around my age or younger or a little older, folks like Brittany Haas and Tatiana Hargreaves and Alison DeGroot. But I think by far my biggest influences, the most direct influences, aren't necessarily all old-time musicians explicitly, right? Because in a sense, we're shaped by so many different forces in our lives, right? So I've been really fortunate to have a lot of amazing teachers, not just in music, but in a lot of different fields, teachers and mentors and creative thinkers and leaders that I found really inspirational throughout my life, like from childhood on up. And I think I find myself kind of thinking back to them and the ways that they shaped me over time. A few folks in Alaska where I grew up, kind of in the folk community there, there were definitely some specific people that were very influential to creating that scene, especially for young people and especially for young women. And I'm thinking of a woman named Mary Shallert, who seemingly single-handedly created like a youth string band scene in Alaska and kept it thriving for so long. Also a woman named Angela O'Dean, who played in a band called Barefoot back in the day and was a few years older than me, and I found her very inspiring at the time when I was a kid. That was great. But these days, I think my biggest influencers is not the word I want to use, but I think these days the people I find most inspirational are my students, because I'm teaching a lot and they're the people that I'm interacting with musically the most. And to see their curiosity and their willingness to engage with sometimes challenging ideas or challenging musical ideas is just, it never ceases to amaze me. And I feel really fortunate to get to witness that on a daily basis. Historically, I'm also remembering folks like Lily Mae Ledford and Matoki Slaughter. And then also I had the privilege to get to play music with Carol Elizabeth Jones, who's a great ballad singer and musician. Just wanted to get them in there too. Yeah. Let's see, how I got into music. My dad was a musician, like a folk musician, played a lot of acoustic music in Alaska, and I grew up in that community. And my mom is also a lover of folk music and many kinds of music. So music was around and accessible and open. I didn't feel like there were many barriers to entry there. I witnessed it being made by people constantly all the time, and witnessed a lot of young people playing music too. So I got my hands on a fiddle at the ripe age of 3, and I'm grateful that my parents made it so approachable. It was fun. It was not a toy, but it was like a thing that I could interact with, like with low stakes, right? And I think that made it really just fun and engaging and like something I wanted to do and kept opting in to do. And then I had peers that I played music with as a kid too, and that was really foundational, I think, for my musical identity, because I got to have autonomy over my own music at a really young age, and that was really empowering to make decisions about the sounds that I was going to make, and the arrangements of songs and which songs I was learning. That was great, and I think that that's a tremendous tool that we have, that we can hand young people that. Anyway, but for old time specifically, so in Alaska where I grew up, because obviously old time music doesn't only exist in the American South, right? It's all over the place and sort of fits into this folk umbrella, which includes the entire world, right? Everybody makes music in some way, and some of those traditions linger and change and evolve over time. In Alaska, a lot of people have moved there over the years and brought their musical traditions and interests with them. So the acoustic music scene there is really diverse. And I grew up playing fiddle in a community where if you play fiddle, you're going to learn a few Irish tunes, a few French Canadian tunes, some old time tunes, some bluegrass tunes, maybe a little Western swing or whatever else was in vogue at the time. So I interacted with old time music as a young person, learning some of the repertoire. And to me, it was just another fiddle tune. I didn't have a firm understanding of genre boundaries until I moved out of Alaska, and I lived in the Hudson Valley area of New York for a while, where I went to college, and realized that, first of all, not everybody is a part of a music community. And I know that's obvious, but to me at the time, it was like, wait a second, I have to seek this actively? This is new and challenging, and I don't really know how to do that. And that's when I discovered that there were distinct genre-based musical communities where I was. So I mostly spent time kind of by happenstance getting to know a bluegrass music community that also dabbled in some like swing music and stuff like that, but was mostly grounded in bluegrass. And I kept hearing about these old time music communities, or people referring to certain repertoires like, oh yes, that's old time, or oh, have you heard of this particular fiddler? They do it in this style that's called old time, and that's distinct from what we do. I moved down to Johnson City, Tennessee to go to graduate school and to be closer to a place that I had so long associated with the music that I played. And that's when the real work began. And I connected with my colleague, Roy Andrade, who was pretty pivotal in opening some doors for me musically, but also just being here, witnessing the place names, hearing the stories from people who have been here and lived this music, or just lived this place for so long, was really powerful and a little magical. In the Masters of Arts in Appalachian Studies program at East Tennessee State University, I was part of their kind of first crop of students, and because of that, it was really flexible and open for me to take it in any number of different directions. So I got to take advantage of the traditional music program at that school as well, and explore some musical interests. And I was playing music professionally and for fun on the side. So I was in the community and attending fiddlers conventions and attending small town festivals and community gatherings, and exposing myself to music as it functions today in these communities. And I love that old time music is so thriving and alive and diverse. It's such a regional based tradition. Like, depending which community you go to, they play different repertoire. They might favor certain keys or styles. They might favor certain historical figures as influencers on that repertoire or those styles. And it's so beautiful to see each of those little iterations kind of popping up in these little pockets of the world. And I think that makes it kind of endlessly interesting and endlessly compelling, because there's always another story to explore, or another iteration of what old time music can be to explore and dive deeper into. I've been fortunate in my experience of music and music communities, and the role that like gender plays in that, never felt particularly restricting to me. So I'm thinking about, playing with inspirational musicians, like live in person, and what that does for me, and those kind of pivotal moments in my own life. And to me, I don't categorize it by like, who were the women that inspired me most? Because in the moment, that's not what I'm thinking about. What I'm thinking about is whatever I'm finding musically moving in that moment. But there are people that I've witnessed, or that I've found I get to view as kind of models for just how to be a good human in the world, or how to be a musician and go about your life in a more meaningful way. And those are often women, right? Because when you're interacting in the world, like, there's all these different kind of spheres of our identity that influence the way that we're perceived, or the way that we're treated, or the way that we need to project ourselves into the world. So of course I'll find the most inspiration from people who are having to navigate similar things that I'm having to navigate, explicitly or not, right? So there's some historical old-time sounds where I don't even know what the musician looked like. I don't really know much about them apart from what I can research, right? But I do know there's some recordings that I've found even more delight in, because I learned that if it happens to be like a man playing the prominent instrument, and that's why I accessed it in the first place, right? Like, oh, I came to it because it's a cool example of some old-time fiddling and I might want to learn the tune. And then there's other instruments in this field recording that I learned were maybe taken in their house or on their front porch or wherever, and I can hear these other instruments and I learned that it might be their family members, like their wives or their children, and I love learning their names and what else they recorded on, or just what their relationship is with that particular recording. And one that I found particular delight in is these recordings of Ed Haley playing with his wife, Martha Ella Haley. I forget her name. I should check that. I'm pretty sure it's Martha Ella Haley, playing mandolin. And to me, her mandolin playing like makes those recordings. It just like uplifts the whole thing. It feels a little silly, but powerful. And I can't imagine interacting with that music without her sounds on there, despite the fact that what leads people to those recordings is Ed Haley's fiddling. But there's another way to tell that story, right? Which is about the recording itself and about what else is giving it context. And I enjoy that. I have always been a musician because my family was musicians and it was always around, and I never had to, like, I don't know, we always sang, we always played, like we were always in, like, making music and listening to music. And so yes, like at my core, I am a musician with an urge to create and explore and make beautiful sounds, and I will continue to pursue doing that in whatever styles of music I keep playing, including old-time music. I think, though, that the thing I find even more fulfilling in terms of impact has to do with education and community building. Like, that's the stuff that really, like, lights my fire and keeps me going, is yes, the sounds fundamentally, but also like what they do for people, like what making music or listening to music or participating in any way in music can do for an individual or for a family or for a community or for the world. Not to get mushy about it, but I love seeing people feel empowered by their ability to play a tune or understand what they're hearing, or just feel a wash of emotion from the sounds that they're hearing, from like a really great banjo tune or from somebody's delivery of this song that just got them. Like, that's phenomenal and fascinating to me. And it's really important to me to keep working as hard as I can to share the power that music has with more people, to make it more accessible, and to let people sort of see themselves in the picture, if that makes sense. To let people see the way in which they and their experiences are reflected in a musical culture. And so I think an exhibit like this lets us do that, because it's us trying to be like, here are some people that create and make and shape this thing that we call old-time music. Like, maybe there's a way in which viewers can see themselves in that in a way that maybe they couldn't before, because of the way that we were telling the story of old-time music in the past. I think feeling like the only one is a challenging feeling sometimes. And I'm not in that situation often, but I am sometimes. And you're aware of it personally. Other people are sometimes aware of it, or might point it out sometimes as either a thing to glorify or just an oddity or whatever it is. It's not a great feeling. Then again, sometimes it can be empowering to be like, all right, like, here I am, time to like represent, or time to challenge people's understandings of what it means to be especially like a young woman in this field. I think it depends on the context. In the world of education too, right? That especially like folk traditional roots music in higher education is not a big field. It's a tiny, tiny little sliver of what higher education represents. And it's exciting to be a part of a program that is making space for that, and that's actively trying to figure out what that can look like. but I'm also one of very few women working full-time in that field. And often it feels like I'm expected to be the voice for all marginalized voices, which is ridiculous because like that's not how that works, right? And sure, I might have like an aspect of my identity that is marginalized, but there's far more that represent sort of positions of privilege for me in the way in which I go about the world. But I often feel like because I'm the young female, figure in that sphere, that it's sort of on me to be the advocate for whatever it is, like the things that aren't currently represented in the dominant white male spaces that I'm often in. And I find that disappointing because that shouldn't fall necessarily on someone like me solely, right? And I would like to think that if people are already having the thought that they're expecting that from someone else, that they would internalize that expectation too. If they're recognizing the need enough to like hire someone to be the voice for that, then like I just wish they would follow that initiative a little with like the urge to also take action themselves. I've been really lucky going about the world as a professional musician and as a young musician, like growing up. I never felt in danger. I never felt explicitly discriminated against. But there's the subtle things, right? Especially in the professional music world, just because it's a lot of people, a lot of times in similar spaces. And because there's like power is at play in a lot of funky ways when you're a performer. Power is just being negotiated all the time. And so you have a lot more opportunities for little points of friction. So that could be interactions with sound people and what they think you know or don't know. It could be with who they talk to in your band, about like who they view as being the leader or the decision maker. It could be, if I'm like one of a few women in a band, oftentimes we kind of remain nameless because we're like the group of women or whatever it is, right? Like we're, like the ladies, like you're the ladies of the band. And sometimes we're viewed as kind of a nameless, faceless group rather than sort of individuals, like empowered individuals. In teaching spaces, I often feel like I have to do a different kind of work than some of my male colleagues because I have to assert my authority because it's not a given. I feel like I can't get away with being, like for some musicians, being accomplished is enough, or having professional recognition as a musician is enough to also make them impactful or respected educators. And I feel like I am not there in that, like, I have to sort of prove my worth all the time and can't rest on my previous accomplishments. It's like a constant act of proving that I know what I'm talking about and I know how to convey it or how to get you to engage with what I want you to engage with. So that dance can be a little exhausting sometimes. But I think a lot of women these days don't think about it anymore because it's just a given, right? We learn how to go about the world in the way that we need to in order to survive and try and thrive. I'm often when I'm like performing in like old time realms specifically, like at festivals that are devoted to old time music, or at just smaller community festivals, often those tend to be older white male spaces. Like that's what they feel like, that's what they're set up for, that's who they're set up to serve. And sometimes it makes me feel hyper aware of my gender presentation and my age and my youth and all of that stuff because it feels like such a contrast in the way that people speak to me or in their expectations of what I'm going to bring to that space. So that can be a little bit difficult to navigate. It's not, at this point it's not difficult, right? I've had to do that a lot. So at this point, it's actually pretty easy. But it's a thing that requires negotiating and navigating and finagling, and sometimes presents like just awkward reminders that people expect me to behave a certain way, to play a certain way, to talk a certain way. I play mostly fiddle when I'm playing publicly and performing publicly, and I like to play hard driving fiddle tunes, and I like to feel secure physically, like in my body on stage, and that's part of the performance too, right? Is like being present and delivering musically what it is that I'm trying to deliver musically, and that requires like some, what does it require? Some assertion, right? Some assertiveness, and I don't think people always expect that from female musicians, or that maybe they expect us to be in supporting musical roles, and I'm not always in a supporting musical role. Sometimes I'm leading the charge, whatever is happening, and I enjoy that, but sometimes I think it also, I hate that it's surprising to some people, or I hate that, you know, it requires bursting some kind of stereotype. So we have expectations of people based on a lot of different parts of their identity that we can see, at least, right? So sometimes it's about their gender, sometimes it's about their race, sometimes it's about the way they're dressed or what their body looks like, sometimes it's about their age. And yeah, I guess I'd mentioned I often feel aware of my role not just as a woman, but also as a young woman in a lot of the spheres that I'm in, and the expectations that come along with that. I think some people expect me to be less accomplished or less confident or less knowledgeable than I am, which feels a little uncomfortable to state out loud, but that's the truth of it, right? And I'm pretty at peace with what I know and what I don't know, where I'm at in my career, the things I'm continuing to learn about and integrate into who I am. But yeah, there's a lot of moments in my life where people make me feel hyper aware of my youth and my femaleness, because it challenges their expectations of what that's meant to look like. And that definitely happens in old time music. And it depends on the setting, right? Old time music takes place in so many different spaces, right? We might associate it with living rooms and front porches, also with like community spaces, also with like festivals and conventions, also on stages or on television or on radio. You know, like all of those different spaces come with their own set of expectations about what role women play in them, or what role anybody plays in them, right? Like they each kind of create their own little microcosm of expectations of how people interact and fit together. And it's interesting because women have long been associated with some of those spaces, like the home and like as community builders, right? Like we, historically, there's this strong association between womanhood and caretaking and community building and being preservers of tradition. So in a sense, women are at the heart of what we think of as being old time music if we think about it through this perspective of like the spaces in which the music takes place. Like they are at the core of what this music is and where it happens. But that's not the only sphere in which old time music takes place. And also that's not the only sphere in which women are central or important or relevant, right? And I love that an exhibit like this can help us celebrate the multitude of spheres in which women play a really crucial role and are actively shaping what old time music is and can be. Better or worse? Well, no, for worse. Much of history is told through the lens of white men. And old time music is no different. And it's good that we're coming to terms with that as a reality, right? It's like becoming aware of who the narrator is and how that skews the story, right? And we should use our ability to craft stories or highlight details or do the research, right? We need to use that power thoughtfully and correctively, right? I think it also has to do with what we have prioritized over time. Like, what's most important about this thing that's happened? And that's usually how we end up telling a story, right? Because we share what we think is most important, but what's most important to me isn't necessarily what's most important to you, or what will be most important to generations from now, people who are hearing the same story. So it's a bit of an invitation to practice empathy in a way, where it's an invitation to consider a story through somebody else's perspective. And we should be doing that all the time, right? Like to reconsider what's most important, or to challenge our biases as narrators ourselves of the stories. I think it's also an opportunity to, going back to that idea of priorities, musical power isn't always loud and domineering, for example, right? So we might think that like something that's musically good is what is flashiest. Sometimes it is, or what's the most skilled performance of a thing. Sometimes that is what's most powerful, but it isn't always, right? Musical power can be found in other things as well, and we can choose to highlight all sorts of different examples of what we find musically powerful, just as an example of how we tell stories. I can find something equally moving and powerful that is soft or that is subtle. Those things can be just as skilled, right, as something that's loud. And that's just an example of a way in which I can question my own sense of what I'm prioritizing musically even. There's just room. There's room for so many stories, room for so many ways of playing music and making music and participating in music. I think it's just pretty crucial that we remember that, and that we celebrate and deepen our own engagement with music, right? Of course that's important. Dig deeper, be curious, like learn more, and like consider that what you think is best, what you think is most important, isn't necessarily what someone right next to you thinks is most important. Or consider the ways in which you see yourself reflected in the music, or maybe you don't see yourself reflected in the music, and consider the ways in which that's different for somebody else. Or consider the ways in which you can help somebody else find themselves in the music. That's a powerful tool. It's good. I love to hear that people think of old-time music as being really participatory, really inviting, really like, yes, all come, all, you can learn to play and make great sounds pretty quickly and be able to participate, right? The like barrier to entry is pretty low in that way, but there's other kinds of barriers to entry, right? There's other ways in which we say that, ooh, this scene actually isn't for you. We might not be trying to say that explicitly, but it comes across in our actions in other ways, about where music is made, right? Or the faces that we see representing it, or who has access to the instruments in the first place, or access to the education to learn how to play them. Some of that is changing in, like with this grand internet age, right? And U2 University, like you can learn a lot through the internet. You can access stories and experiences that you might not have otherwise. But that's not an end all. That's by no means like a grand solution to diversifying our music communities. But I think this idea of thinking about it as like storytelling and just continuing to ask ourselves these questions about what stories am I telling, who gets to tell stories in the first place, who are these stories for, and who are they representing, is a really powerful tool to get us to think more critically about what these music communities can look like in the future. Like often gender roles feel pretty firm in some people's minds about who's allowed to do what or whose responsibility is what. Historically, we might think of them as being even more entrenched about women's role as family, I was going to say managers. What's a more empowering word? I guess it has to do with like the kinds of labor that we associate with different gender roles, right? So often women were considered responsible for taking care of the kids, for having kids and raising them and maintaining the home and helping them live, for doing all sorts of kind of home-based labor, which is crucial to the function of humanity, right? But work like that doesn't often leave time for pursuing things like music careers or other kinds of careers, right? But music included. But there is still room, and there was always room for music in the home. And there's lots of stories of women as music makers in the home, right? I mean, that's it exists in that sphere as much as anywhere else. And I think that it's really cool that that's like a corner of what old time music is it has to do with sort of women singing these songs connected to different labor, right? Connected to work songs in a sense, right? I think a lullaby can be considered a work song if we want it to be, right? That's a form of labor. But yeah, I guess it could be viewed as a barrier, and that women were expected to take care of this multitude of tasks just related to family maintenance and raising children and feeding the family and all of that stuff. And some I've heard stories about how women were told that they couldn't play the fiddle because it was like the devil's instrument. It was associated with things that women were to be kept away from. That wasn't their sphere. So there's barriers like that, right? Other kind of social barriers. The scenes and settings in which live music might have been taking place, sometimes women were excluded from those settings, certain like dance scenes or whatever. We are somewhat limited by what's been documented already, right? There's this great tradition of field recorders in old time music. Field recording is like kind of central to the function of old time music, which is so cool, right? I'd say it's almost as important as like the making of the music is the people that document it, and that continue to tell those stories. So we're a little bit limited by what we have documented, and that's the product of what decision making took place on the part of the field recorders. So like what's documented is what we have today to tell the stories by. And it so happens that most of what was documented wasn't women making music. Old-time music thrives in community, right? It wants people. It wants to be around people. It wants to be in social settings, as much as it wants to be the weird, crooked, twisty solo banjo piece, right? Like there's room for that, absolutely. And it wants to be celebrated and explored and perpetuated in community settings. So my hope is that an exhibit like this can also like reach community and collaborate with community. If it's traveling to different spaces, hopefully those places can figure out ways to invite community participation in some way, right? That would be my hope, is that it reaches beyond the walls of the exhibit itself, and that it's about sort of taking the questions of the exhibit and asking them of your own communities and your own musical spaces. I would also hope that like maybe live music can be made within the walls of the exhibit. This is a like thriving, live and breathing tradition that's always evolving and changing, and the best thing we can do to like emphasize that this story of old time music is so multifaceted is by like presenting the sound itself, right? Like embodied in today's musicians. My gut reaction is that I don't think everybody has to care about old time music. You really don't. If it's not for you, it's not for you. That's fine. There's plenty of things in this world that also aren't for me, and no shame. But I think we can all do a much better job of just being curious people, right? That's one of the best practices in our everyday lives, is just to remain open and curious, to want to ask questions about why something is the way it is, and to learn how it became that way. I think taking an interest in community traditions is such a rich subject matter that I would hope that anybody, you kind of can't help but be intrigued the more that you dive into something. I mean, I love to hear anybody tell me about why they care about what they care about. It's the best question ever. What's important to you and why? It's super compelling. And I think old time music is that thing for so many people. And I think that's because, at least for me, the music itself it has a little magic. It just does. Partly because I find that it challenges some notions of kind of dominant Western classical musical expectations, right? It has its own sort of vernacular, right? It has its own sonic reality, its own system that makes it sound the way it sounds. And I love that it challenges those same expectations that other genres have, right? It has its own way of being that sometimes interacts with other genres of music. It's obviously not a standalone, perfectly boxed in little style, right? Collaboration is happening constantly and has always been happening constantly. We just want to draw boundaries around it so that we can make sense of it, because that's what humans do. But I think finding whatever it is that sparks you is the best thing to do, right? So, and to find that, you have to explore and you have to ask questions and you have to experiment and learn and grow and deepen your awareness until you find that thing that lights you up about it. And I think because old time music is so vast and encompassing, there's the ability for a lot of people to find that spark somewhere. I find folk traditions so interesting, whatever they are, wherever they are. And it so happens that I've spent the most time digging into old time music specifically. And as a result, my relationship with it is far deeper than anything else. So I feel it's yeah, I mean, it really is. You build a relationship with something that's really special to me. It's a part of my family now. It's this thing that I carry with me and that shapes who I am. And I can't imagine not living my life with it. And so I just look forward to investing in it further, right? And deepening my own understanding of what it is and what it can be. So just, it's also connected to my relationship with the fiddle as an instrument. I mean, that's something that I've also built over a long time, longer than even my relationship with old time specifically. And so at this point, it just feels like it's sort of a language that I've learned to speak on this instrument that's so important to me. And I want to stay fluent. And I want to figure out how I can use that language to create new sounds and to find the way in which it relates to other styles of music. And also in a kind of bigger picture way, I think it's just, I'm so delighted by the role that music plays in humanity and in our world history. I just love that sound and rhythm and pitch is so fundamental to who we are as humans, that this iteration of that is just so beautiful and rich, and it's worth celebrating. I envision the future of old time music as being, in general, more empathetic and open and self-aware. And I think it's really productive to interrogate these boundaries that we construct around things, and both musical boundaries and social boundaries, because it's all involved, right? All of it's related. A musical kind of culture is sort of the perfect grounds for analyzing the funky ways that humans and sound interact, and how we sort of use those things to create boundaries or to challenge boundaries and all of that good stuff. But yeah, I envision a future that just continues that process of interrogating those boundaries. It's not to say that like they all need to be torn down. It's just like we need to consider why they are the way they are, who that's serving, if we've drawn them in the right place, if we need to draw them at all. I'm really inspired by a lot of musicians today who are doing that kind of work, who love this music so much and want to share that with people, but want to do so in a way that isn't perpetuating some of the harmful boundaries that have been drawn in the past. So I'd like to think that the future of old time music will, the space for that kind of work will just continue to grow. And that maybe in the future there will be people who, when they hear the word old time music, well, I don't know the answer to that, but I'd be really curious in like 50 years what the concept of old time music means to people. We might not even call it old time in the future. I mean, it hasn't always been called old time. Like the language itself will absolutely change because it always does. And the tradition itself might change because it always has been. So I find myself kind of excited and curious to see what that evolution will look like. And I feel optimistic because I know there's so many people that are really advocating for sharing and for not obscuring the things we wish weren't a part of it, right?